Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Development Insights podcast, where we bring you ideas, experiences, and best practices from the real estate development industry. My name is Payam Noursalehi. I'm the president of Dena Project Management, a construction and development management firm that helps real estate developers define, design, and deliver successful projects. Thank you for being here. This is our 50th episode. So there's a special thanks to everyone who's been with us through this journey for the past couple of years. It has been such an interesting journey. I've learned a lot. I've enjoyed a lot of great conversations with our guests offline and online and with our audience. A lot of them who've been kind enough to reach out to us over the past couple of years, share their thoughts, their insights, and feedback. Some of them very candid feedback that they've shared with us. So thank you very much. It's been fun. It's been a very interesting experience for myself here. And before I forget, if you have not already subscribed to our podcast here, please ensure to do so because it really helps us grow the show and reach out more audience as we go through this exercise together. So today's episode is a little bit different. Typically, you're used to us having a guest in each episode as an industry leader, someone who has a lot of experience and thoughts that they share with us, and they basically let us into their brain. They shared their wisdom with us, everything they've learned over the years, and that has been a very interesting medium. But considering that we reached the milestone of 50 episodes, I want to start trying something new in the hopes that we can bring you even more value. And we will introduce something that is a little bit different. Some shorter format episodes such as this one, where we bring you some of the actual live events, industry updates, and ideas and potentially frameworks, which we'll do in this episode, that we're working on, which hopefully you will find helpful through your daily day-to-day business and activities. One of the comments that we've heard from our listeners over the past 50 episodes has been some of the concepts have been very great. They apply to larger and more mature organizations, but what about our daily situations? What about our daily decision making? If you've been following the show long enough, you know that I'm a practical person. I try to keep the conversations very practical, try to find real life examples of that. So with that being said, we're going to try this new format, and we're still going to have the interviews with the industry experts as a main part of our podcast going forward. But we'll have shorter episodes here and there to try and bring our other concepts to life and talk about other items that are going on, which might not necessarily require an hour-long conversation with an expert with decades of experience. One of my main reasons for starting this podcast a couple of years ago was to learn more about the industry that I've been working in for most of my life. I've been involved one way or another in construction, design, and engineering and real estate development investment throughout my whole life. And truth be told, like probably most of the professionals who are listening to this podcast can relate to, when you are a professional, you tend to put your head down, go deep into your own silo, and not necessarily know or understand what's going on in the other parts of the project. That was one of the main reasons I started this podcast, because I have a lot of questions, if you haven't noticed so far. And the environment of working on a project or inside a project team does not necessarily lend itself to asking very wide and open questions and getting very clear answers. Some developers that I've worked with have been great in that regards, and they're very willing and open to share their experiences and insights in terms of what's going on. And others are, I guess they have reasons and they're less so inclined to sharing and being transparent about the project. So this was a perfect medium to do that. And I hope that so far you've enjoyed doing this. One of the overarching questions that has always been on my mind, one of the main reasons we started this podcast, was try and figure out one overall question. Why do some projects fail while others succeed? Or, put another way, how can you increase your chances of success in your current or your next project? So it's a simple question, right? It sounds like a simple question, but the more you spend time in industry and the more you realize that, as simple as it may sound, it's super complicated. Basically because projects don't really fail because something super dramatic happened, like in the movies, and like all of a sudden everything fell apart. Based on my experience and based on all the conversations that we've had, on this podcast, there are a multitude of factors that can lead to failure of a project. And in the background, I've been trying to put together a framework based on, again, work experience, real life experience, and also more than 50 professionals that we've had on this podcast, and we've asked them those questions. We've been trying to come up with a framework, a decision-making matrix, whatever you want to call it, to try and help with answering that question. Try and help with coming up with a good answer to that question about how do you increase your chance of success on your next real estate development project. If I want to sum up, most of the time, based on what we've heard on this podcast and also outside of it, projects fail because a series of risks go underappreciated. There are assumptions that go unchecked. People are not really paying too much attention. Poor decision-making, bad timing, and luck is a factor, I have to admit. Luck, and in the bigger macro environment, is a really decent factor that you have to allow for. You have to account for in your equation to the best of your ability. And on the other side, what has become more and more apparent to me is that projects don't really succeed or necessarily succeed because the developer is such a genius. But typically it's because they really understood the risks, they had the right team, they made the decisions when they were needed, and they had a framework for making those decisions. They had a mental map or roadmap or mental model that helped them make the decisions. And I think it might be stretched, but let me put it this way. They stayed within a lane that they could actually manage, something they felt comfortable dealing with. So far, based on all this that we just described, I've created something that we call the Development Readiness Framework, which is not a scientific model, just so we're clear. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a scientist trying to solve this problem. I'm just documenting our real world experiences. It's a living framework, so it will evolve based on what we see, based on more conversations that we have. But the goal of it is to find a useful way of thinking about whether a developer, specifically first-time developer or early-stage developer, are they really ready? What are their weak points? What are their blind spots? And later on, I'm going to touch on why I think this is the right time to have this conversation in the context of City of Toronto and in Canada, mainly because we see a lot of new developers coming to market. We'll explore that a little bit later. And bottom line is, this is my best effort at documenting what we've learned so far and trying to share it with you guys. I hope you find it helpful. I'll share more of it as we go through. I want to start with this quotation from Sheldon Rosen, who was our first guest on the podcast on episode 2. And he rephrased or reused a phrase that we've heard on TV probably too many times about gambling. And that phrase was, know your limit, stay within it. And he applied that concept to the game of real estate development. It stuck with me because it has so many different applications when it comes to development. And we've seen this conversation come up time and again when we interviewed the guests on this podcast. Starting from that premise, and I want to go to how we came up with a framework. Back in the school days when I was studying for my MBA, and they were going through whole bunch of different courses. One of the lessons, one of these strategic planning courses really stuck with me. And it was around Jack Welch. I don't know if you know Jack Welch, but Jack Welch was the legendary CEO of General Electric, who basically, when he came into power and took the role of being CEO, that there was a dying giant that he inherited. And very big company, very familiar household name, but it was struggling. And it was in too many businesses trying to do too many different things all at once. And it was having a hard time. So he did a very remarkable turnaround of GE as we know it, and it's still around. And he had frameworks and patterns of doing that, but there were 2 questions that he asked to help him to make decisions and make that turnaround happen. One of them is of particular interest to our conversation here. The 2 questions were, what business are we in? Number 1. And number 2, can we be number 1 or number 2 in the market for our business? The second question, I don't want to dive into today in this conversation, but the first question, what business are we in? I think is of super importance and super relevance to what we're trying to achieve here. And I think clarity on the answer to that question will help us significantly in creating the next steps. So let's think about it for a second. Let me ask you this. What business are you in? Or what business are we in if you're a developer or a real estate professional? What business are we in? And just take a minute. Take all the fluff away. Take all the fancy word and phrases and renderings and E&O insurances and everything else away. What are we in at the end of the day? You might say we're in construction. You might say we're in real estate. You might say we're housing. I might say we run a project management company. And they're all true to a degree. But if I want to strip away the fluff and narrow down on what is the essence of what we're doing, I think all of us who work in real estate development are to some extent in the business of risk management. That's it. That's what we do. We manage risk day to day, different levels of risk, different priorities, and different strategies. And that has been one of the core messages that have echoed through multiple episodes and multiple conversations that we've had with the developers on this podcast and the professionals, that risk is primary, our bread and butter, right? Yes, we deal with the design. Yes, we deal with the concrete and steel and drywall and consultants and lenders, permits, marketing, approval, sales, you name it, like tons. There's no shortage of things you deal with as a development professional or as a real estate developer. But underneath all of that, what we're basically doing, we're trying to manage, mitigate, eliminate risk. We're typically taking capital that is very hard earned, whether it's our own or someone else that we're raising, and we're putting it at risk for exchange for a possible future outcome, which hopefully is better than what we started with. That's generally the gist of running a business. But in the case of development, I would argue that we're faced against significantly wider range of risks that most of them we don't have control over. And somehow the deck is not stacked for us, and in most cases against us, at least in context of Toronto and GTA. It's changing recently. It's getting a little bit better. We'll dive into that. So bottom line is, the better you are at identifying, understanding, pricing, sequencing, and managing risk, the better chances of success you have on your project. You miss your risks, you don't understand them properly, you don't plan for them properly, and you very quickly get in trouble. As, again, we've talked multiple times on this podcast, you can get too bogged down over design. You can get too bogged down on energy, efficiency, aesthetics, this and that and the other thing. Marketing, sales, promotions, launch events, as it used to happen a few years ago. But at the end of the day, it's all about risk. You have to manage it, and we go from there. Okay, so with that established, I think that's the basic premise of the conversation we're going to have. The next question will be, okay, we're in the business of risk management. What do we need to do? What do we really need to be good at to be able to manage risk properly? I would argue, and based on all the conversations that we've had on this podcast, the most critical skill a developer needs is effective decision making. If development is fundamentally a risk management practice or exercise, then you really need to be able to deal with multiple risk factors that come up all the time and deal with them as quickly as possible to the best way that you know how at the moment based on the information, and the results will show that. So it's not perfect decision making. It's not decision making with full information. God knows that's not the case most of the times. It's not decision making under certain circumstances that you know everything clean cut and you have obvious answers. You rarely have the luxury of having 100% certainty about anything when you're in the game of development. And you can ask that from anyone who has ever developed something, that they have to make decisions after decisions after decisions on a daily basis. And if you're lucky, you have 51% certainty when you're making that decisions. And quite honestly, most of the time you end up making decisions with less than 50% certainty. That's the game. And you still need to decide. You need to choose a site, you need to choose a partner, you need to just choose your design, you need to select your consultants, you need to come up with a legal structure, contract structure, density, approval, and design strategy. And what I've found over and over throughout my career, and this has been best echoed by one of our great clients and a personal friend, Steven Saval at Windmill Developments. He's a partner there. He always keeps saying, in every meeting we had, he kept saying, no decision is often the worst decision. You need to make a decision and move forward. You adjust as you go. That's definitely the most critical skill a real estate developer needs to develop, is to be able to make decisions quickly, to the best of their ability, and move on. And quite frankly, that's why mindset matters so much. You need to be a certain breed of person to want to take on that leadership and development role. You can't sit around waiting for others to tell you what to do. You need to be leading the team. You need to be the leader of the team. And for being the leader, you need to make decisions. Some of those decisions you will regret down the road. One of the things that I've learned over time, and it has come up on this podcast as well, is you cannot get emotional. You have to stay disciplined. I remember asking this question from Justin Aikler on one of the episodes, a third generation developer who I've worked with quite a bit. And I asked him, how do you stay so calm after receiving all these news that something has gone wrong, something is not working the way it's supposed to be? And I guess his response, and I'll refer you to that episode, but his response somewhat came down to, we know the game. This is what it is. You can't freak out anytime. It's messy, it's ambiguous, it's relentless, and it just keeps happening. So Shaquille Walji from Share Corporation had a similar statement. You roll with it, go to bed, sleep, breathe, exercise, take a shower, you wake up next morning, and you go from there. Why is this an important conversation to have right now? This is also important to talk about. There's some good things happening. We live in a crazy world. Trust me. I know it. Fully understand it. You open the news, there's too many things that you can worry about. But I also want to look at glass half full. A silver lining, maybe. Finally, eventually, in our city, in Toronto, and the GTA area for the most part, there are some changes happening. There are new avenues being provided for smaller, first-time developers who want to get into the business, be part of the solution, and do something about the problems that we're having. Being it a multiplex project, a 4+1, being a mid-rise on an avenue or a major street, or other types of projects that are becoming feasible and viable gradually, some more than the others, through government incentives, through programs such as CMHC. And I'm seeing increasingly a number of people who are coming in, again, wealthy individuals, very smart individuals from other industries. Citizen developers is what they're calling them. And they're coming into this game. And I worry sometimes, quite honestly, because a lot of them are very smart and they've done great before. And it might take them by surprise how different our game is when it comes to building a new project, starting a new project. Because as anyone who's gone through this would tell you, it's not rocket science. Anyone and everyone can probably figure it out. It's just a million different decisions that you need to make, most of them on a daily basis, results of which you will probably not know for a few years. And that's a long learning curve, which can turn into an expensive exercise if you haven't done that before, or if you don't have the right people on your team who can provide you with those inputs. So if you're a lawyer, if you're a business owner, if you're a landowner, if you're a landlord who has capital, who's trying to take on the challenge of becoming a real estate developer, which is why we're here, which we are here to empower you, which we're here to help you. We want to make sure that at least you understand what business you're in. You're not in the business of building beautiful things. My architect parents would disagree with me, but you're not in the business of building beautiful things. You're in the business of managing risk, getting a return on the investment while leaving a legacy, making an impact on your society, and providing a service to your community so that you can do it again. Otherwise, we're in trouble. It's a one-off. You're never going to do it again. You're going to probably discourage other people from doing it as well. We don't want that. That's not what's going to be part of the solution. So it's very important to understand what the business we're in, what's the critical skills. And I'm going to wrap this episode by just touching base on, we talked about the development readiness model and framework. And I'm going to just quickly touch on what this framework is. And in the future episodes, we're going to dive deep into different parts of this framework, and hopefully it will help you even more. So we went through all of the transcripts of these episodes, and we tried to narrow it down. There are too many things that our guests have touched on, but after spending a couple months, we've managed to narrow it down to, which I think is a generally acceptable framework. Again, it's not science, it's not research, it's just me trying to organize my thoughts. And we've narrowed it down to 6 pillars or 6 parts to successful development. And like I said, in future episodes, we're going to go through them all in detail, but these are the 6 pillars that we think are important for any new developer or first-time developer to be wary of or aware of when making decisions, acting on a daily basis, and hopefully having a very successful project. Which, by the way, if I forgot to say this before, none of these rocket science. They all sound pretty simple, but they're not easy to deal with. So number 1 is local market fundamentals, knowing the market. Number 2, capital structure and financial feasibility, the good old pro forma. Do my numbers make sense? Questions. And can I get other people to invest in my project? That's the second part of that question. Third is the ownership, tax liability, and basically the legal structure, which we have talked about this on this podcast. And unfortunately, I don't think enough people pay enough attention to those 3 items because they will have an impact, especially on the tax side, in different capacities, and legal liabilities. Number 4 is design and approval strategy. What I've learned, again, through this podcast and through real life experience is that you cannot have a successful project if you actually don't have a strategy for your design and approvals. So we're going to talk about that in more detail. We're going to talk about the execution and risk management. Again, we touched it. This whole thing is about risk management, and these are different categories of basically risk. But there needs to be a system. There needs to be a practice, a framework for you to actually do that on a daily basis, not just know about it, but actually do it and look after it. We're going to talk about that. And number 6, and the final one, the final pillar, is the operational discipline and mindset. And some of that we touched on in this episode. We're going to dive into it a little bit more in future episodes. And those 6 will form the pillars of this framework. So this is a development readiness framework that we've created. And we've also created an assessment. It's a free assessment. It takes like 5 minutes to complete. There are like 25, 30 questions that you answer. And it kind of gauges you on where you are in your journey on these 6 different categories. So if you want to take that assessment, please go to developmentreadinessassessment.com, developmentreadinessassessment.com. That's the website. You can find it also in the show notes. It's a free assessment, 5 minutes. You get a basic reading on where you are, and hopefully you can repeat that reading again in a few years and see how far you've come. And with that, I want to thank you again for being here for our 50th episode. This has been such a fun ride, such an informative ride. Great people to meet, great connections, lots of things I've learned. And I thank you for all of that. If you find this episode interesting, or if you have other suggestions for us, please feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn or our website, where you can go to our website. You can find the link in the description and let us know what you think. In the future episodes, we're going to dive deeper into those pillars and talk more about them. Thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed listening.